The phone call that shattered everything came at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in September. One of those calls that arrives in the dead hours when nothing good ever happens. When the ringing itself is a warning that someone has died or been arrested or made a decision so catastrophic it couldn't wait until sunrise. I was 29 years old, living in Seattle, Washington, in a small studio apartment I'd rented 6 months earlier, after finally accepting that I needed physical distance from my childhood home, from the constant tension that had become our new normal, from the woman who'd moved into my late mother's space and spent 4 years systematically erasing every trace she'd ever existed. My phone lit up the darkness of my bedroom like a searchlight, vibrating against the wooden nightstand with an angry insistence that cut through my sleep like a blade. I grabbed it with one hand while rubbing sleep from my eyes with the other, squinting at the too bright screen that burned my dark-adjusted vision. The name displayed made my stomach drop instantly, made my heart rate accelerate before I was even fully conscious. Diane, my stepmother. The woman my father had married 2.5 years after my mother's death from breast cancer. The woman who'd smiled warmly at the funeral reception and told everyone how she'd always admired Mom from a distance. How honored she was to eventually become part of our family. The woman who'd slowly, methodically, deliberately worked over the following years to remove every photograph, every keepsake, every tangible reminder that my mother had ever lived in that house, had ever been part of our family, had ever existed in the world at all. I almost declined the call. Every instinct I'd developed over 4 years of increasingly toxic interactions screamed at me to send it straight to voicemail, to roll over, to pull the covers back over my head and deal with whatever crisis this was in the morning when I had coffee in my system and emotional armor in place and wasn't vulnerable in the darkness of 3 a.m. when defenses are low and everything feels more overwhelming. But something stopped my thumb before it hit the red button, some premonition I couldn't name, some sixth sense developed from years of walking on eggshells, some intuition that this wasn't just another one of Diane's typical late-night drunk dials, where she'd ramble incoherently for 40 minutes about how ungrateful I was, or how my father never defended her properly, or how she'd sacrificed everything to join a family that didn't appreciate her contributions, or understand her perspective. Hello? My voice came out rough with sleep, already defensive because 4 years of experience had taught me that nothing good ever came from conversations with Diane at 3 in the morning, that these late-night calls were always manipulation or guilt-tripping or some new grievance she'd been nursing all evening while drinking wine alone in the living room. I did it, she said, and I could hear the unmistakable slur of someone who'd been drinking heavily for many hours, probably red wine based on her preferences, probably alone because my father was away at a conference and she had no one to perform for, no one to moderate her behavior. I finally fucking did it, and you know what, Jessica? It feels incredible. It feels like freedom. I feel liberated for the first time in years, like I can finally breathe in my own home without that dead woman's ghost hovering over everything. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake despite the hour, adrenaline flooding my system in response to something in her tone that was different from her usual drunk rambling. I fumbled for the lamp switch on my nightstand, knocked over a glass of water in the process, didn't care about the spreading puddle as I finally got the light on and blinked against the sudden flood of illumination. Diane, what are you talking about? Did what? It's almost 3 in the morning. Are you okay? Is Dad okay? She laughed, and it wasn't her normal laugh, the one she used at dinner parties when my father told stories about his engineering projects, the one she deployed strategically when she wanted to seem charming and easygoing, and like the cool stepmother who got along with everyone. This laugh had edges, sharp and vicious and triumphant, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up, that triggered some primitive threat response deep in my brainstem. Your father is fine. He's in Portland at his conference, completely oblivious, probably sleeping peacefully in his hotel room with his phone on silent like he always does when he travels. He has no idea what I just did, but he'll find out soon enough. You'll make sure of that, won't you? You'll go running to him like you always do, playing the loyal daughter, turning him against me. Diane, what did you do? I asked again, more forcefully this time, my teacher voice activating, the firm Brooke no-nonsense tone I used with high school students who were deflecting or avoiding or trying to manipulate their way out of consequences. I burned them, she said, and now her voice was gleeful, proud, like a child showing off a particularly impressive accomplishment. All of it. Every single goddamn thing you and your father kept like some kind of pathetic shrine to the perfect dead wife who could do no wrong. All those boxes taking up valuable space in the garage like a museum nobody wanted to visit, but everybody was too sentimental to clear out. All those clothes hanging in the attic that nobody was ever going to wear again, but that your father insisted on keeping in case someone wanted them someday. All those ridiculous knickknacks and photographs and letters and jewelry and books and teaching materials and everything else. I loaded it all, every single item, into the big burn barrel out back, the one we use for yard waste, and I poured lighter fluid on it, and I watched it burn. I stood there for 3 hours feeding more and more stuff into the flames, watching it all turn to ash, every single piece. The words didn't compute at first. My brain couldn't process what she was saying, couldn't connect the sounds coming through my phone to any meaning that made sense in reality, in the world I understood. It was like she was speaking a language I knew all the words to but couldn't translate into comprehension. What did you burn? I asked, even though somewhere in my nervous system I already knew, even though my heart had already started racing and my hands had already started trembling, because my body understood before my conscious mind caught up, before my rational thought process could organize the information into something manageable. Your mother's things, Diane said, and her voice shifted from gleeful to something darker, something that sounded like vindication mixed with rage that had been festering for years. Every single item that woman left behind in what is supposed to be my house now. The wedding dress she kept sealed in that stupid preservation box in the attic, like it was some kind of sacred relic, instead of a piece of fabric nobody would ever wear again. The 17 photo albums. I counted them, Jessica, 17 goddamn albums, documenting every boring moment of your childhood like you were some kind of celebrity instead of just a regular kid. Her jewelry, including that ugly turquoise necklace your father gave her for their 15th anniversary that she treated like it was made of diamonds and rubies when it probably cost $200 at some mall store. Her collection of antique teacups that took up an entire shelf in the china cabinet, taking up space where I could have displayed things I actually chose, things that represent my taste. All her teaching materials from 23 years of high school English classes, boxes and boxes of lesson plans and student papers and teaching awards that nobody cared about anymore. Her grandmother's quilt that she was supposedly saving to give to you someday, the one your father wouldn't let me use because it was too precious. The love letters your father wrote her when they were dating long distance in college, tied up with a ribbon like something out of a bad romance movie. Everything. It's all ash now, all garbage anyway, just junk cluttering up my house, constantly reminding everyone that I'll never measure up to perfect dead Catherine, who apparently never made a mistake or had a bad day or did anything wrong ever. Catherine. My mother's name was Catherine Marie Harrison before she married my father and became Catherine Harrison Beck, though everyone called her Kate or Katie. She died 6 years and 4 months ago after a brutal 18-month battle with breast cancer that metastasized to her bones and lungs, and eventually her brain, reducing the vibrant woman who'd taught literature to teenagers for over 2 decades, and directed community theatre productions, and filled our home with laughter and music, and the smell of her famous spaghetti sauce to a skeletal stranger who couldn't remember my name half the time because of the morphine required to manage her pain in those final weeks. You're lying, I said, even though I knew she wasn't, Even though I could hear the truth in her voice, could sense her satisfaction in finally doing something she'd apparently been fantasizing about for years, planning for, waiting for the right opportunity. You didn't. You wouldn't dare. Dad would kill you. You'd be destroying his property, destroying irreplaceable items. You wouldn't actually do that. Oh, I absolutely did, Diane said, and I could hear her moving around now, could hear the clink of a wine glass being refilled, could picture her pacing through that living room with her phone pressed to her ear, and that horrible smile on her face that she got when she thought she'd won something, when she thought she'd finally proven a point or gotten revenge or established dominance. I've been planning this for months, maybe even years if I'm being honest with myself, waiting for the right opportunity, for a time when your father would be gone long enough that I could do it properly without being interrupted or stopped. Every time your father went on and on at dinner about how Kate used to make these amazing Sunday dinners with homemade bread and 3-course meals, or how Kate had this particular way of folding fitted sheets that he'd never been able to replicate, or how Kate loved watching thunderstorms from the porch and would make hot chocolate and sit there for hours just watching the rain, I thought about it. I planned it. Every time you came over for dinner and spent half an hour going through those photo albums in the den like you were visiting a grave, touching the pictures like they were holy relics, telling the same stories over and over about, remember when Mom did this, or remember when Mom said that. I wanted to do it. Every time anyone mentioned her name at a family gathering like she was some kind of saint, instead of just a woman who got cancer and died and left the rest of us to pick up the pieces, I fantasized about making her disappear completely. And tonight, with your father away at that engineering conference in Portland for 3 whole days, I finally had my chance, and I took it, and it was glorious. I've always hated how you people kept her as part of your lives, like she was still here, still relevant, still more important than the people who are actually alive and present, Diane continued, her words coming faster now, lubricated by alcohol and unleashed rage that had apparently been building for years. You need to learn to let go. You need to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past, like you're all frozen in amber at the moment she died. You should actually be thanking me right now, Jessica. I'm helping you heal. I'm helping this family finally put the past behind us where it belongs and focus on the present, on the people who are actually alive and here and trying to build something new. This is a favor, really. You'll see that eventually when you've had time to process and think rationally instead of emotionally. You'll realize I did what nobody else had the courage to do. I couldn't find words. My mouth opened, but nothing came out except a small sound that might have been the beginning of a word or might have been just air escaping. I just sat there in my bed in my Seattle apartment at 3 a.m, holding my phone and listening to this woman who'd married my father tell me she'd destroyed every physical reminder of my mother's existence. And I couldn't formulate a response because my entire system had essentially shut down, stopped processing, gone offline in the face of information too horrible to integrate into my understanding of reality. I hung up, just pressed the red button and ended the call because I couldn't listen to her voice for another second, couldn't hear her justify what she'd done, couldn't stomach the pride in her tone as she described destroying things that were irreplaceable and precious, and the last tangible connections we had to the woman who'd raised me and loved me and shaped who I'd become before cancer took her away far too young. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard, trying to decide if this was real or if I was having some kind of stress nightmare, if I'd actually wake up and discover this conversation had never happened. My water glass had spilled across my nightstand and was dripping onto the floor. My lamp was on but too bright, harsh. The city outside my window was dark and quiet. Everything felt surreal, disconnected, like I was watching my own life from outside my body. Then my phone started buzzing again. Not a call this time. Text messages flooding in one after another, the notification sound becoming a continuous buzz that wouldn't stop. I looked at the screen and saw they were all from Diane, message after message appearing faster than I could read them. I opened the message thread with shaking hands that could barely hold the phone steady, and I immediately regretted it. I should have turned the phone off. I should have thrown it across the room. I should have done anything except open those messages. Pictures. She was sending me pictures. Photograph after photograph after photograph of ashes and charred remnants in what looked like an old metal drum in the backyard, the one my father used for burning yard waste and fallen branches. I could see the melted corner of what might have been a photo album, the vinyl cover bubbled and destroyed by heat. I could see the twisted metal frame of what might have been the framed portrait my mother had loved of the three of us taken at a studio when I was 10 years old, all of us dressed up and smiling, one of the last professional portraits we'd taken before Mum got sick. I could see fabric reduced to blackened threads that might have been the wedding dress, or might have been clothes, or might have been the quilt. I could see paper reduced to flakes of grey ash that floated on the surface of other debris, so thoroughly destroyed you couldn't even tell what they'd been before burning. Objects that had been whole and meaningful and full of memory transformed into unidentifiable debris, into trash, into nothing. And interspersed between each image, Diane had inserted laughing emojis, the crying laughing face, repeated over and over, sometimes 3 or 4 in a row. Like destroying my dead mother's possessions was the funniest thing that had ever happened. Like this was comedy gold worthy of celebration. Like she'd just pulled off the prank of the century instead of committing an act of devastating cruelty. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone multiple times. My vision blurred with tears I didn't remember starting to cry, didn't consciously decide to cry, that just started flowing on their own in response to what I was seeing. My breathing became shallow and rapid, hyperventilating, my body going into full panic mode as my nervous system tried to process trauma it had no framework for. And through it all, one thought kept cycling through my mind on repeat like a mantra or a prayer. Dad. I need to tell Dad. He needs to know what she did. He needs to know right now. He can't find out by going home and seeing empty shelves and empty boxes and empty spaces where Mum's things used to be. My father and I were supposed to be on a hiking trip when all this happened. We'd planned it for months, a long weekend in Olympic National Park. Just the two of us, something we'd been trying to do twice a year since Mum died, as a way to maintain our relationship outside of the house where Diane controlled every interaction and every conversation, where we couldn't talk honestly because she was always there, always listening, always ready to take offence or make everything about her feelings. We had permits for backcountry camping, had packed our gear weeks in advance, had been looking forward to 3 days of trails and campfires, and the kind of easy conversation that's impossible when Diane is hovering and interjecting and making everything about how we were excluding her or not considering her perspective or treating her like an outsider in her own home. But at the last minute, literally 48 hours before we were supposed to leave, my father's firm had asked him to represent them at an engineering conference in Portland. Something about a last-minute cancellation by a senior partner, an important client who'd specifically requested my father's expertise on structural bridge design, the kind of professional obligation you can't easily refuse when you're 56 years old and thinking about retirement timeline negotiations and maintaining your professional reputation. He'd apologized profusely when he called to tell me we'd have to postpone, promised we'd reschedule the hiking trip for the following month, assured me he'd only be gone for 3 days and we could do something together the following weekend instead. Maybe drive out to the coast, visit the Olympic Peninsula, something lower key that didn't require permits and advance planning. I'd been disappointed but understanding. Work obligations are work obligations, especially in a competitive field like structural engineering, where reputation and client relationships determine career trajectory and partnership considerations. I'd told him it was fine, that we'd find another time, that I understood professional obligations came first sometimes, that I'd use the weekend to catch up on grading anyway. I was a high school English teacher myself, following somewhat in my mother's footsteps, though I taught at a different school in a different district, and I always had papers to grade, essays to comment on, lesson plans to refine, curriculum to develop. Now I was scrambling to find my father's contact information on my phone, my fingers clumsy on the screen, my eyes barely focusing through tears that wouldn't stop falling. I called his cell phone. It rang 6 times. Long enough that I counted them, that each ring felt like an eternity, and went to voicemail. He was probably asleep in his hotel room, phone on silent or charging in another room, or just turned off because he always turned off his phone at night when he travelled so he could sleep without being woken by spam calls or work emails coming in at odd hours. I tried again immediately, my heart pounding. Voicemail again after 6 rings. 3rd time, surely he'd hear it. Surely the repeated calls would wake him up, or at least alert him that something was wrong. Voicemail again. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone. I wanted to drive to Portland right now and pound on his hotel room door until he woke up. But I didn't know which hotel he was staying at, didn't have that information, had never thought to ask because why would I need to know that? I sent him a text message, my fingers fumbling on the screen, making typos I had to correct. Dad, call me immediately. Emergency with Diane. She destroyed everything, all of Mum's things, everything. Please call as soon as you see this. Please. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have done but couldn't stop myself from doing. I forwarded him every single one of Diane's pictures, every image of ash and destruction and melted remnants, every laughing emoji, every piece of evidence of what she'd done. I sent them one after another, not stopping to think about whether this was the right way to deliver this information, whether I should wait and tell him in person or at least over the phone so he'd have support when he learned about it. I just sent them all until my entire text conversation with my father was just a long scroll of horror, a visual documentation of cruelty and betrayal and irreplaceable loss. My phone rang 23 minutes later. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on my phone screen, watching the minutes tick by, unable to do anything else except wait. 23 minutes. My father, calling back, his voice thick with confusion and sleep, and the disorientation of being woken at 3:10 in the morning by multiple missed calls and a flood of disturbing text messages. Jessica, what's wrong? What's this about Diane? What emergency? I can't really make sense of your texts. The pictures aren't loading properly on the hotel Wi-Fi. They're just showing up as grey boxes. She burned everything, I said, and my voice broke on the words, cracked right in half like something physical had snapped inside my throat. Mum's things, all of it. Every single thing we had left. The wedding dress, the photo albums, the jewellery, the quilts, all the teaching materials, the love letters, the teacups, everything. She called me at 3 in the morning to brag about it. She said it was all junk, and she was doing us a favour by getting rid of it so we could move on. She sent me pictures, Dad, pictures of Mum's stuff burning in a barrel in the backyard, with laughing emojis. She was laughing about it. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped, thought we'd lost connection. I pulled the phone away from my ear to check if the call was still active. It was. He was there, just not saying anything. Then I heard my father make a sound I'd never heard before in my entire life. Something between a gasp and a sob, something primal and wounded, the sound of something breaking inside a person. She wouldn't, he said, but it wasn't a statement. It was a desperate hope, a plea to the universe. She couldn't have. These pictures could be fake. She could be lying, trying to hurt us, trying to cause problems. This could be some kind of sick joke. She knows we were supposed to be on our hiking trip. Maybe she's angry I chose work over vacation. Maybe she's trying to punish me. She told me exactly what she burned, I said, cutting off his desperate rationalizations because I needed him to understand this was real. This had actually happened. There was no way to explain it away or minimize it. She described specific items. Mum's turquoise necklace, the one you gave her for your anniversary. The quilt from her grandmother with the hand-stitched stars. Your love letters from college tied with that blue ribbon. The teacup collection with the rose pattern. She knew what she was burning, Dad. She was specific. She did this deliberately. She's been planning it for months, she said. She waited until you were gone for 3 days, so she'd have time to do it properly. I heard something that might have been my father crying, or might have been him trying not to cry, trying to hold himself together, trying to maintain composure in a hotel room in Portland at 3 a.m. with his world falling apart over a phone line. I need to come home, he said, his voice strained and strange. I need to leave right now. I need to see. I need to... Jessica, I can't breathe properly. Something feels wrong. My chest. There's pressure. Dad! Alarm shot through me like electricity, cutting through my own grief and horror with sharp, immediate fear. What's wrong with your chest? What kind of pressure? It's tight, he said, and I could hear him struggling to breathe now, could hear the effort in every word. Really tight, like someone's sitting on it, and there's pain, spreading to my arm, my left arm. I can't, it's hard to get a full breath. Dad, hang up right now and call 911, I said, my teacher voice activating, the firm command voice I used when a student was hurt in my classroom or there was an actual emergency that required immediate decisive action without debate. Right now, you might be having a heart attack. I'm completely serious. Hang up and call 911 immediately and call me back after they get there. Do not wait. Do not try to tough it out. Call them right now. I'm okay, he said, but he didn't sound okay at all. He sounded like he was struggling to breathe, like every word required Herculean effort, like he was trying to minimize something that shouldn't be minimized. I just need to calm down. I just need to process this information. I just need to... Dad, please, I said, and I could hear the edge of panic in my own voice now, could hear how close I was to completely breaking down. Please call 911, please. I can't lose you too. I can't lose both of you. Please, you need to call them right now. Promise me you'll call them. He must have heard something in my voice, the genuine terror, the edge of hysteria I was trying to control, the fact that I was begging, because he said, okay, you're right, I'll call them right now. I'll call you back as soon as I can. The line went dead. I sat there in my bed staring at my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in my fingertips. Shaking uncontrollably despite not being cold, crying without really being aware I was crying, and praying. I'm not religious, haven't been since my mother died, and all the church platitudes about God's plan and everything happening for a reason rang so hollow and cruel that I stopped going to services. But I prayed anyway, to whoever or whatever might be listening. Please don't let him die. Please don't let Diane's cruelty kill him. Please let him be okay. Please let the paramedics get there fast. Please let this not be a heart attack. Please, please, please. 15 agonizing minutes later, my phone rang. Not my father's number. A number I didn't recognize with a 503 area code. Portland. I answered before it could ring a second time. Hello, is my father okay? Is he alive? Please tell me he's alive. Is this Jessica Beck? A professional female voice asked, calm and steady in that particular way medical professionals have when they're dealing with panicked family members. Yes, I'm Jessica Beck. Where's my father? What's happening? Is he okay? Your father is stable and conscious, the voice said. A paramedic, I realized, or maybe an ER nurse, someone used to delivering information clearly and efficiently to terrified relatives. He's being transported to Oregon Health Sciences University Hospital right now. He experienced what appears to be a cardiac event. We're still running tests to determine the exact nature and severity. He's receiving oxygen and cardiac monitoring. He asked me to call you and let you know he's alive and receiving appropriate care. He wanted to make sure you knew so you wouldn't worry. I'm worrying anyway, I said, trying to keep my voice steady and failing completely. Is he going to be okay? What's a cardiac event? Is that a heart attack? Is he going to die? I can't give you a definitive prognosis at this time, the voice said, maintaining that professional calm that was probably meant to be reassuring, but just made me more anxious. We won't know the extent of the damage until we've completed testing. What I can tell you is that he's conscious, he's breathing on his own with supplemental oxygen, and he's receiving the best possible care. Are you able to come to Portland? Yes, I said, already out of bed, already pulling on yesterday's jeans from the floor where I'd discarded them. I'm in Seattle. I can be there in under 3 hours if traffic is light. Tell him I'm coming. Tell him to stay alive. Tell him I'm on my way and he needs to wait for me. Please tell him that. I'll let him know, the voice said. Drive safely. The emergency department at OHSU is expecting you. Ask for the cardiac unit when you arrive. The line went dead. I was already moving, already grabbing my car keys from the hook by the door, already shoving my feet into sneakers without bothering to tie them. I grabbed my wallet, my phone charger, a jacket. Didn't bother changing out of my pajama pants. Didn't brush my teeth or wash my face or do any of the normal morning routines. Just ran to my car in the building's parking garage and started driving south toward Portland, toward my father, toward whatever was waiting for me at that hospital. I drove to Portland in a dissociative fog that felt like being underwater or watching my life through thick glass, my hands on the steering wheel, but my mind somewhere else entirely, not really present in my body or the car or the highway stretching south through the darkness of pre-dawn Seattle. I-5 at 4 in the morning is mostly empty, except for long-haul truckers moving freight between cities, their massive rigs creating wind tunnels as they passed, and I pushed my aging Honda Civic to speeds I normally wouldn't risk, desperate to get there, to see my father, to make sure he was really alive and not just stable in the way hospitals say when they're preparing you gently for the worst possible outcome. I made it to the hospital in 2 hours and 47 minutes, breaking multiple speed limits, running one questionably yellow light in Olympia, not caring about traffic laws or tickets or anything except getting to my father as fast as physically possible. I parked illegally in the emergency room lot, didn't care about the no parking signs or the threat of being towed, just abandoned my car in the first available space and ran through the automatic doors into the fluorescent brightness of the ER waiting area that smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee and human fear. I gave the receptionist my father's name, Roger David Beck, and my relationship, daughter, only child, next of kin, and she directed me to the cardiac care unit on the 3rd floor where he'd been moved after initial emergency treatment and stabilization. I took the elevator because it was faster than the stairs, trapped in that small metal box with a man in scrubs who looked exhausted from what had probably been a long night shift. Both of us staring at the floor numbers lighting up, neither of us speaking. 3rd floor. The doors opened. I followed the signs to cardiac care, checked in at the nurses' station, was directed to room 347 at the end of the hall on the left. I walked down that corridor past other rooms where other families were dealing with their own medical crises, their own fears, their own vigils, and every step felt surreal and inevitable simultaneously, like I was moving through a dream I'd had before but couldn't quite remember. I found him in a private room, hooked up to monitors that beeped rhythmically in a way that should have been reassuring. Beeping means alive, means heart still beating, means not flatlined, but was actually terrifying because it made everything so real, so clinical, so undeniably serious. An IV in his left arm delivering fluids and medications. An oxygen cannula in his nose with the tube looping behind his ears. Heart monitor leads disappearing under his hospital gown, tracking every beat. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, diminished somehow, my father who'd always seemed solid and capable and eternal, suddenly looking fragile and old and breakable in that hospital bed with its crisp white sheets and adjustable mattress and safety rails. His eyes were closed, but they opened when I entered the room, responding to the sound of the door or my footsteps, or just some parental sixth sense that knows when your child is nearby. When he saw me standing there in yesterday's jeans and my pajama top and my hastily thrown-on jacket, the relief on his face was so profound it made my chest physically hurt, made breathing difficult in a different way than his oxygen-restricted breathing. "Jess," he said, his voice hoarse and rough like he'd been yelling or crying or both. "You drove all night. You shouldn't have driven that fast. You shouldn't have—" "Of course I drove," I said, cutting off his protests as I pulled a chair up to his bedside and took his hand carefully, mindful of the IV line taped to the back of it. "Where else would I be? What did the doctors say? What happened? What's wrong with your heart?" "Heart attack," he said simply, like he was reporting that he'd bought groceries or changed the oil in his car instead of delivering news that his body had tried to kill him. Myocardial infarction is the technical term the cardiologist used, brought on by extreme emotional distress combined with existing risk factors I apparently didn't know I had. High cholesterol that I thought was controlled with medication but wasn't. Some arterial blockage they found when they did the imaging. Chronic stress from work that I downplayed. They said if I'd waited much longer to call for help, if I'd tried to tough it out or convince myself it was just heartburn, if the paramedics hadn't gotten there so fast and gotten me on oxygen and monitoring immediately, I might have— He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say died, couldn't voice that alternative timeline where he didn't make it, where I got a different phone call with different news. "But you didn't," I said firmly, squeezing his hand gently, trying to project confidence and certainty I didn't entirely feel. "You called for help and they got there, and you're going to be okay. You have to be okay. They're talking about surgery," he said, his voice quiet, scared in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "Something about placing stents to open the blocked arteries to make sure blood can flow properly to my heart muscle. They showed me images of the blockages. It was like looking at clogged pipes in a house, except these pipes are keeping me alive. Recovery will take months, they said. I'll need to make major lifestyle changes, diet, exercise, stress management, medication regimen." The doctor was very clear, very serious when he looked at me this morning. He said any additional significant stress could cause another attack, potentially fatal this time. He said I need to eliminate sources of stress from my life immediately and completely, not reduce them, eliminate them. We both knew what that meant. We both understood perfectly well who the primary source of stress in his life was. Diane. Diane, who'd just destroyed irreplaceable belongings. Diane who'd bragged about it. Diane who'd directly caused this heart attack by her cruelty. Diane was, quite literally, a threat to my father's continued existence if she remained in his life, in his house, in his daily environment. "Has she called you?" I asked quietly, already knowing the answer but needing to ask anyway. "After she called me, did she tell you what she did? Does she know you're in the hospital?" My father shook his head, the movement small and tired. "My phone's been off since I got here. They took it when they admitted me, put it with my other belongings in that cabinet over there. I haven't looked at it. I've been too focused on breathing, on getting through the tests, on not dying. I haven't checked messages or voicemails or anything. I assume she's tried to contact me, though. She always does when she's done something she thinks might have consequences." "She might not know this happened," I said slowly, thinking through implications and possibilities. "She might not know you had a heart attack. She might still be at the house, sleeping off her wine hangover, waiting for you to come home from your conference so she can see your reaction to what she did, can feed off your pain and shock." "Good," my father said, and his voice had an edge I'd never heard before, something cold and final and absolute, like a door closing and locking. "Let her wait. Let her wonder why I'm not answering. Let her stew in whatever guilt she might be capable of feeling, though I honestly doubt it's much. We'll deal with her when I'm strong enough to deal with her, not before, not while I'm in this condition. The doctor said stress could kill me, so she doesn't get to add more stress until I'm physically capable of handling it." I stayed in Portland for 6 days while my father underwent surgery and began initial recovery. The procedure went as well as could be hoped, 2 stents placed in blocked arteries, a third blockage that was being managed with medication rather than additional hardware, prognosis reasonably good if he followed medical recommendations strictly and avoided stress triggers. I took emergency leave from my teaching job, called my principal and explained the situation, got approval for a week off with family emergency leave. I found a cheap hotel near the hospital that advertised weekly rates and had a tiny kitchenette, spent my days sitting by my father's bedside, reading to him, or working on my laptop while he slept, spent my evenings researching heart attack recovery protocols and stress management techniques, and divorce attorneys who specialized in high-conflict cases. Because it was clear, even without explicitly discussing it in detail, that my father's marriage to Diane was over. Completely, irrevocably, permanently over. You don't destroy your spouse's deceased first wife's belongings out of jealousy and then brag about it and put that spouse in the hospital with a heart attack and come back from that. Some betrayals are final, some cruelties are unforgivable, some actions sever relationships beyond any possibility of repair. This was all three. On the fourth day, when my father was stable enough to have difficult conversations without his blood pressure spiking dangerously, when he could sit up in bed and talk for more than a few minutes without getting winded, we talked about what came next, about practical steps and legal realities. "I want her out of the house," he said, his voice steady despite the difficulty of what he was saying. "I don't want her there when I'm discharged and come home. I don't want to see her face or hear her voice or have to deal with her presence at all while I'm recovering. I can't heal in an environment where she exists. The doctor was clear. Stress is literally dangerous for me now. She's stress incarnate." "Okay," I said carefully, trying to think through legalities and logistics. "But legally, she lives there. She's your wife. You've been married for 4 years. We can't just kick her out without going through proper legal channels. She has tenant rights, even aside from marriage rights. We need to do this correctly, or it could backfire and cause more problems." "Then we go through proper channels," he said, and I heard steel in his voice, determination I recognized from when he'd set his mind to something and wouldn't be deterred. "Find me the best divorce attorney in Seattle. Someone aggressive, someone who specializes in difficult cases. File papers immediately, as fast as legally possible. I don't care what it costs. Money doesn't matter. I'll sell the house if I have to, cash out retirement accounts, whatever it takes. I want her out of my life permanently before she actually succeeds in killing me." I spent that afternoon on my laptop in my father's hospital room while he dozed between nursing checks, researching family law attorneys in the Seattle area, reading reviews on legal websites, checking bar association records, making calls to offices, and asking questions about availability and expertise and approach to high-conflict divorces. I found a woman named Patricia Chen, who came highly recommended, who specialized in divorces involving emotional abuse and property destruction, who had a reputation for being aggressive but ethical, who could file papers quickly and get emergency orders in place while the divorce proceeded through the courts. I called her office from the hospital hallway, explained the situation in broad strokes to her paralegal, husband currently hospitalized after heart attack caused by wife's emotional cruelty, need to file for divorce immediately, and get temporary orders preventing contact and establishing exclusive occupancy of marital home for husband's health and safety. The paralegal said Patricia was in court but would call me back within 2 hours. She called back in 90 minutes. I gave her the full story, the burning, the bragging, the pictures with laughing emojis, the heart attack, the hospitalization, the doctor's warnings about stress being potentially fatal. Patricia listened without interrupting, asked pointed questions about timeline and documentation and assets and the marital home's ownership history. "I'll take the case," Patricia said after hearing everything. "And I'll be honest with you, this is one of the more clear-cut cases of emotional abuse and intentional infliction of emotional distress I've heard in 20 years of practice. We have documentation of the destruction. We have her own words admitting to it and expressing no remorse. We have medical records connecting the emotional trauma directly to a life-threatening health crisis. This isn't a he said, she said situation where both parties have reasonable grievances. This is a situation where one party committed intentional acts of cruelty that resulted in serious harm. I can file papers within 48 hours. I can have her served by the end of the week, and I can file for emergency orders giving your father exclusive occupancy of the home based on medical necessity. While all of this legal machinery was being set in motion, Diane was calling, and calling, and calling. My father's phone, which I'd retrieved from the cabinet in his room and taken control of so he wouldn't be stressed by seeing her name pop up repeatedly. My phone, which rang at increasingly irrational hours with her number. The hospital's main line, where she called asking for Roger Beck's room number and was told they couldn't confirm or deny whether he was a patient due to privacy regulations, which apparently made her furious based on the increasingly angry voicemails she left on my phone, demanding I tell her where he was and what was going on. We didn't answer any of her calls. We let them all roll to voicemail. We listened to her messages cycle through the predictable stages: confusion to concern, to frustration, to anger, to rage, to self-pity, to blame. Roger, it's me. Why aren't you answering? I've been calling since yesterday. Are you okay? Did something happen at the conference? I'm starting to worry. Call me back when you get this. Okay, it's been 2 days now and you're still not answering. This is getting ridiculous, Roger. I know you got my calls. I know you're getting my messages. Whatever you're mad about, whatever Jessica told you, we can talk about this like adults. Just call me back. Fine. Silent treatment. Very mature, Roger. Very mature way to handle disagreement in a marriage. Punish me with silence like a child instead of having an actual conversation. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I've been dealing with for 4 years. Jessica, I know you put him up to this. I know you're behind this. You've always hated me. You've never given me a fair chance. You've been working to turn your father against me since the day we met, and now you're finally succeeding. Congratulations. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied? You know what? Fine. Don't call me back. See if I care. I did what I did and I'd do it again. You both needed to move on from that dead woman, and clearly you weren't going to do it on your own, so I helped. I took initiative. I did something difficult that needed to be done, and if you can't appreciate that, if you can't see that I was trying to help this family heal, then that's your problem, not mine. That's your dysfunction, not mine. The messages were evidence, Patricia Chen said when I forwarded them to her email address. Documentation of Diane's lack of remorse, her refusal to take responsibility, her aggressive response to being held accountable, her attempts to manipulate and blame shift. All useful in divorce proceedings, all demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior that made her unsuitable as a presence in my father's recovery environment. My father was discharged from the hospital after 6 days with an extensive list of medications: blood thinners, beta blockers, cholesterol medication, aspirin, and follow-up appointments with a cardiologist, a cardiac rehabilitation program, and strict written instructions about physical activity limitations, dietary restrictions, and stress management requirements. I drove him home to Seattle, but not to the house he shared with Diane on Mercer Island, not to the home that now had empty shelves and empty boxes and empty spaces where my mother's belongings used to be. We drove instead to my studio apartment where he could stay with me temporarily, where he'd be safe from Diane, where his environment would be calm and controlled and as stress-free as I could make it. Patricia Chen had already filed the divorce papers that morning. I'd signed as witness to the documentation, had provided my statement about the phone call and the pictures, had handed over screenshots of every message Diane had sent. Patricia had also obtained a temporary restraining order that barred Diane from contacting my father directly, from coming within 500 feet of him, from interfering with his medical treatment or recovery. The papers were being served to her at the house that afternoon by a professional process server, a woman named Maria who'd done this hundreds of times and knew how to handle hostile recipients. According to Maria's report, which she emailed to Patricia and Patricia forwarded to me, Diane's reaction was theatrical and predictable. She'd screamed that this was all a mistake, that Roger would never actually divorce her, that I was behind all of this and manipulating him, that she was the real victim here, that we'd both regret treating her this way. Then she'd called both of our phones approximately 40 times in 2 hours, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails threatening legal action of her own, threatening to contest the restraining order, threatening to go to Roger's employer and tell them what a horrible person he was, threatening to expose our abuse of her to extended family and mutual friends. More evidence for Patricia's files, more documentation of exactly why Diane couldn't be trusted to be part of my father's recovery. For the next 3 weeks, my father slept on my pull-out couch in my tiny studio apartment that was never meant to house 2 adults long-term, while we figured out next steps and longer-term arrangements. He couldn't go back to the house, not just because of the restraining order keeping Diane away from him, but because being in that space, seeing all the empty places where my mother's belongings used to be, would be psychologically devastating for someone recovering from a stress-induced heart attack. Even thinking about going back there made his blood pressure spike, made his chest tight, made him start breathing rapidly in a way that terrified both of us. We started looking for a new place for him, somewhere smaller and easier to maintain than the 4-bedroom house on Mercer Island, somewhere with no stairs because stairs were dangerous for his cardiac condition, somewhere with no memories of either my mother or Diane, a fresh start, clean slate, ground floor condo or apartment in a building with elevator access, and ideally some kind of community space where he could meet people and rebuild his social life. A home that would be his alone, filled only with things he chose to have there, with no ghosts except the ones he deliberately invited in through photographs or mementos he selected for himself. In the meantime, we settled into an awkward routine in my 400-square-foot studio. He slept on the pull-out couch, which couldn't have been comfortable for a man recovering from heart surgery, but which he never complained about. I tried to give him as much privacy as possible, spending extra hours at school, going to the library to grade papers, giving him alone time in the apartment to rest and recover without feeling like he was being watched or monitored constantly. We ate simple meals together, nothing fried, nothing high in sodium, everything heart-healthy according to the guidelines his cardiologist had provided. We watched cooking competition shows in the evenings because they were mindless and entertaining and didn't require heavy emotional investment. We didn't talk about Diane unless we had to for legal reasons. Patricia Chen was working on the divorce with impressive efficiency and strategic aggression. She'd filed for dissolution of marriage on grounds of extreme cruelty and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She'd attached evidence of the property destruction, my screenshots of Diane's texts and photos, my written statement about the phone call, the timestamp data proving when everything happened. She'd included my father's medical records from the hospitalization with the cardiologist's notes explicitly stating that the heart attack was precipitated by acute emotional stress. She'd subpoenaed Diane's phone records showing the exact time she'd called me to brag about the burning, providing a direct timeline from her actions to my father's medical crisis. She'd filed motions for my father to retain sole ownership of the marital home based on the fact that he'd owned it free and clear before the marriage, that it had been purchased with my mother and had sentimental value beyond its monetary worth, that Diane had contributed nothing to its purchase price or mortgage payments during the marriage. Diane fought everything, as we knew she would. She hired her own attorney, an aggressive man named Bradley Winters, who apparently specialized in maximizing divorce settlements for lower-earning spouses and had a reputation for being theatrical and combative in court. She contested the restraining order, claiming she was being unfairly punished for household management decisions. She claimed she deserved half the house's current market value, which had appreciated significantly in the Seattle housing market over the past decade, despite not having contributed anything to its purchase, because she'd maintained it during their 4-year marriage. She claimed she deserved substantial monthly alimony for at least 10 years because she'd sacrificed career opportunities to be my father's wife and manage his household. She claimed the destruction of my mother's belongings was disposing of clutter with her husband's implicit permission and helping the family heal from unresolved grief rather than the malicious act of cruelty it obviously was. Her attorney actually used those exact phrases in legal filings. Disposing of clutter with implicit permission. Helping the family heal from unresolved grief. As if burning someone's deceased spouse's irreplaceable possessions without asking, in fact deliberately waiting until that person was out of town so they couldn't stop her, was a therapeutic intervention rather than a sadistic act of jealousy and control dressed up in pseudo-psychological language. The divorce dragged on for 9 months, 9 long, expensive, emotionally draining months of legal filings and counterfilings, depositions where both parties had to answer questions under oath, mediation sessions that went nowhere because Diane refused to compromise on anything, discovery processes where attorneys requested documentation of everything from bank statements to emails to social media posts, negotiations that broke down repeatedly because Diane kept changing her demands and moving goalposts. 9 months of Diane trying to paint herself as a victim of a cold, distant husband and his manipulative, interfering daughter. 9 months of her denying what she'd done, then minimizing it, then justifying it, then claiming it wasn't that bad, and we were overreacting, cycling through every classic abuser tactic in the playbook. But Patricia Chen was better at this than Bradley Winters. She had better evidence, stronger legal arguments, more thorough understanding of family law precedent, and judicial temperament in King County. And crucially, devastatingly, she had the truth on her side. Diane really had destroyed irreplaceable property that didn't belong to her, really had caused my father to have a life-threatening heart attack, really had shown absolutely no genuine remorse or understanding of the harm she'd caused, really had attempted to manipulate and gaslight and blame shift instead of taking any responsibility for her actions. The judge assigned to the case, a woman in her early 60s named Margaret Sullivan, who'd been on the family court bench for 18 years and had apparently dealt with plenty of people like Diane in her career, was not sympathetic to Diane's claims or Bradley Winters' theatrical presentations. She ruled decisively in my father's favour on almost every significant point. Diane got nothing from the marital assets except what she'd brought into the marriage, which was essentially nothing. Some furniture from her previous apartment, her personal clothing and effects, her car which was in her name. She was ordered to vacate the marital home within 30 days of the divorce decree being finalised and to remove only her own possessions, with any disputed items to be photographed and evaluated by a neutral third party. She was ordered to pay her own legal fees because the court found her litigation tactics were designed to prolong proceedings unnecessarily rather than reach fair resolution. She was ordered to have no contact with my father except through attorneys. And most importantly, most satisfyingly, Judge Sullivan included a specific finding in the written divorce decree noting that Diane's destruction of my father's deceased first wife's property constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress, that her actions showed reckless disregard for the emotional and physical well-being of her spouse, and that her behaviour during the divorce proceedings demonstrated a pattern of manipulation and refusal to accept responsibility that made reconciliation impossible. That language mattered, that finding mattered, because it meant there was a legal, official, permanent record of what Diane had done. It wasn't just our word against hers, wasn't just family drama or he said, she said. It was documented in court records that would follow her, that future partners could potentially discover if they searched public records, that created a paper trail of exactly who she was and what she was capable of. By the time the divorce was final, 9 months and 12 days after Patricia filed the initial paperwork, My father had already moved into a small 2-bedroom ground-floor condo in a quiet neighborhood in North Seattle, had returned to work on a carefully reduced schedule with accommodations for medical appointments and cardiac rehab sessions, had been attending his rehabilitation program faithfully twice a week, and making steady progress in his physical recovery. He'd lost 30 pounds through the combination of stress, medication, and dietary changes. He looked different, thinner, older, more fragile, but he was alive and healing and moving forward with his life. What we didn't have, what we'd never have again, was the physical stuff that Diane had destroyed. My mother's wedding dress that I'd always imagined maybe wearing or repurposing someday, or at least keeping as a tangible link to their marriage. Her jewellery, some of which had been passed down from her grandmother and had generations of family history embedded in the metal and stones. The quilts her grandmother had made by hand, stitched over hundreds of hours with patterns that told stories. The photo albums documenting my entire childhood in chronological order: birthdays, holidays, school events, family vacations, ordinary Tuesday afternoons that seemed unremarkable at the time but became precious after she was gone. Her teaching materials from 23 years of inspiring students and making them love literature, lesson plans she'd refined over years, student thank you notes she'd saved, teaching awards and certificates recognizing her excellence, the love letters my parents had written each other during college when they were at different schools, chronicling the development of their relationship through handwritten pages tied with ribbon. All of it gone, reduced to ash, scattered into landfill or absorbed into soil, irretrievable and irreplaceable forever. I struggled with this loss in ways I hadn't expected or anticipated. I thought I'd done my grieving when my mother died 6 years earlier. I thought I'd processed that loss, accepted it as much as you can accept losing a parent to cancer when you're only 23 years old, learned to carry the grief and build a life around it. But having her belongings destroyed was like losing her again in a different way. A fresh grief on top of old grief that hadn't fully healed. A new wound in tissue that was still tender from the first injury. I started seeing a therapist, not just someone I talked to occasionally when things got rough, but regular weekly appointments with a psychologist who specialized in complicated grief and family trauma. His name was Dr. Marcus Lynn, and he was in his 50s with kind eyes and a calm presence that made it easy to talk about difficult things. He helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a legitimate, recognized form of loss, that objects aren't just objects when they're connected to people we've loved and lost, that they serve important psychological functions. Physical objects are anchors to memory, Dr. Marcus explained in one of our early sessions. They're tangible connections to people who are no longer physically present with us. They're ways of keeping the past accessible and real and confirmed. When someone destroys those objects, especially deliberately and maliciously, it creates a particular kind of trauma. Not just the loss of the objects themselves, but the violation of trust, the deliberate harm, the sense that someone actively tried to erase parts of your history and identity. Your mother's things were stolen from you, he continued, not lost accidentally in a fire or flood or natural disaster where there's no one to blame, not gradually disposed of over time as part of a healthy process of letting go and moving forward, but deliberately taken and destroyed by someone who should have been protecting them, who was in a position of trust and access. That's traumatic. That's a betrayal. You're allowed to grieve that as deeply as you need to, for as long as you need to. My father started seeing Dr. Marcus too, both individually and in joint sessions with me, where we'd sit on his comfortable couch and talk about the burning, about Diane, about my mother, about what it meant to move forward when something crucial had been taken from you without your consent. We talked about anger and its proper expression. We talked about forgiveness and whether it was even necessary or healthy or appropriate in a situation like this, where the person who'd harmed us showed no genuine remorse or understanding of what they'd done. Forgiveness is not always the goal. Dr. Marcus told us repeatedly, countering years of cultural messaging that said you had to forgive people who hurt you in order to heal and move on. Sometimes forgiveness is appropriate when someone who's harmed you acknowledges that harm, shows genuine remorse, makes real efforts to repair what they've broken, and changes their behavior going forward. But when none of those things happen, when someone refuses to acknowledge harm, minimizes it, justifies it, or shows no capacity for empathy or change, forgiveness isn't healing. It's just letting them off the hook for something they should absolutely be held accountable for. Sometimes the goal isn't forgiveness, he continued. Sometimes the goal is just integration, finding a way to live with what happened without it destroying you, to carry the anger and grief and loss without those feelings consuming your entire existence, to build a future that acknowledges the past honestly without being imprisoned by it. About 14 months after Diane's burning, following a year of weekly therapy sessions and hard psychological work, my father and I did something Dr. Marcus had suggested. We created memory books dedicated to my mother. Not replacements for what we'd lost. Nothing could replace my mother's actual wedding dress with its specific fabric and construction, and the particular smell it had acquired over decades of storage, or her grandmother's quilt with its hand-stitched patterns and the tiny imperfections that proved it was made by human hands. But something. A way of preserving memory in a different form since the original form had been destroyed. I reached out to everyone I could think of who'd known my mother, her former teaching colleagues who'd worked alongside her for years, her college friends who were scattered across the country but who still remembered her fondly, extended family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, my mother's surviving brother, former students who I tracked down through school alumni networks and social media. I asked them all to share memories, to write down stories they remembered, to send any photos they had saved in their own collections, to tell me what my mother had meant to them and how she'd impacted their lives. The response was overwhelming in the best possible way. Dozens of people contributed, sent emails and letters and Facebook messages sharing stories I'd never heard before, perspectives on my mother I'd never considered, photos from angles and occasions I hadn't known existed, teachers who'd learned their craft by watching her teach, students who'd discovered their love of literature in her classroom and went on to become English teachers themselves, continuing her legacy. Friends who'd been supported through divorces or career changes or health crises by her steady presence and wise counsel. Family members who shared memories of my mother as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman before I existed. One of her former students, now a teacher himself at a high school in Spokane, sent me a 3-page single-spaced letter about how my mother had changed the trajectory of his life by believing in him when no one else did, by staying after school to tutor him when he was failing her class due to a chaotic home situation, by encouraging him to apply to college when he thought he wasn't smart enough or didn't deserve that opportunity. I became a teacher because of your mum, he wrote. She showed me what education can do when it's done with genuine care combined with high expectations. Every day I teach, I try to honor her example. I try to be for my students what she was for me. Her influence ripples out through hundreds of kids she never met, kids I'm teaching using methods I learned from her. I compiled all of these stories and photos and memories into a large leather-bound book, the kind with thick pages and a proper binding that would last. I organized it chronologically, starting with stories about my mother's childhood and moving through her life, college, early career, marriage, motherhood, her teaching prime, her illness, her death. I included the digital photos we'd backed up before Diane's burning, printed on quality photo paper. I included handwritten letters that people had sent, scanned at high resolution so the handwriting was preserved. I included teaching evaluations and student thank you notes that her colleagues had saved copies of. I included everything I could gather that proved my mother had existed, had mattered, had touched lives in meaningful ways. My father created his own version, approaching the project differently based on his own memories and needs. He wrote long, detailed entries about their courtship, their wedding, their early years of marriage, the struggles they'd faced together and overcome, financial stress in their 20s, fertility struggles before I was finally conceived, the normal challenges of long-term partnership. He included practical things too, her recipes written in his handwriting since hers were lost, attempting to recreate from memory the exact way she made her famous spaghetti sauce or her chocolate chip cookies that everyone always requested at potlucks. He drew sketches of objects he remembered, her favorite coffee mug with the chipped handle, the reading chair where she'd spent countless hours, the garden stones she'd painted with inspirational quotes. The books weren't replacements for what we'd lost. Nothing could truly replace my mother's physical belongings with their specific history and texture, and the particular way they'd lived in our house for years. But they were something. They were a way of preserving memory actively and intentionally, of creating new artifacts that honored what had been destroyed. They were proof that even when someone tries to erase history, memory persists if people make the conscious choice to preserve it. We also decided to start a scholarship fund in my mother's name for students interested in becoming teachers, particularly those planning to teach English or literature in underserved communities, where my mother had spent the final decade of her career after transferring from a wealthy suburban district to an inner-city school that needed experienced teachers willing to work with challenging populations. We seeded the fund with some money from my father's divorce settlement. There was a certain poetic justice in using money that came indirectly from Diane's cruelty to create something that honored my mother's legacy. And we invited contributions from anyone who wanted to participate in keeping her memory alive in a functional, forward-looking way. We set up the scholarship through the Community Foundation, worked with them to establish criteria and selection processes, created an application that asked students to write about why they wanted to teach and what kind of teacher they hoped to become. We named it the Katherine Harrison Memorial Teaching Scholarship, and we committed to awarding at least one full scholarship annually to a college student studying education, with preference given to those planning to teach in high-need schools or work with disadvantaged populations. The first scholarship was awarded about 18 months after my mother's death, approximately 6 months after Diane's burning. The recipient was a young woman named Maria Gonzalez, a first-generation college student from a farming community in eastern Washington, planning to study elementary education and return to her hometown to teach, where the student population was predominantly Latino and many kids spoke English as a second language, and educational resources were severely limited compared to wealthy districts near Seattle. At the small award ceremony we organized at the Community Foundation's office, Maria gave a brief speech about why she wanted to teach that made both my father and me cry. "I want to be the person who sees potential in kids that everyone else has written off or given up on," she said, her voice steady and confident, despite being nervous about public speaking. "I want to be the person who makes students believe they're capable of more than they thought possible, that they deserve access to the same opportunities as kids in wealthy districts, that their language and culture are assets rather than deficits. I want to be the kind of teacher that Mrs. Harrison apparently was, based on everything I've read about her in the scholarship materials and everything I've heard from people who knew her. Someone who changed lives not through dramatic interventions, but through consistent belief and high expectations and genuine care." Maria had never met my mother. She was only 14 years old when my mother died, living in a completely different part of the state, attending schools my mother never taught in. But through the scholarship, through the materials we'd created describing my mother's teaching philosophy and approach, through the stories we'd gathered from former students and colleagues, my mother's impact was extending to students she'd never taught, in schools she'd never visited, touching lives in ways that would have been impossible if she was still alive and teaching in her single classroom. I thought about Diane in that moment, watching Maria accept her scholarship check and promise to honor my mother's legacy through her own teaching career that was just beginning. Diane had tried to erase my mother's impact, to burn away every physical reminder of her existence, to make it so we'd forget her and move on and give Diane the undivided attention and validation she craved. But instead, we'd found ways to amplify that impact, to spread it further, to make it more intentional and more lasting and more public than it had been when it was just contained in boxes in our garage gathering dust. The scholarship became an annual event that our family looked forward to, a way to honour my mother that felt active and forward-looking rather than just nostalgically dwelling on the past. Each year we'd meet the recipient or recipients. Some years we had enough donations to award 2 scholarships instead of just 1, and hear their stories about why they wanted to teach, what they hoped to accomplish, which populations they wanted to serve. Each year, I'd come home from these meetings feeling like my mother's legacy was alive and growing, and reaching into the future in ways she could never have predicted when she was teaching her classes and grading papers, and staying late to tutor struggling students. My own teaching career was influenced by all of this in ways I didn't fully recognize until years later, until I had enough distance to see the patterns and connections. I'd always loved teaching, had always felt it was my calling, in the same way my mother had felt called to education. But after everything that happened with Diane, after creating the memory books and the scholarship fund, and seeing concretely how my mother's teaching had impacted so many lives over decades, I became more intentional about my own practice, more conscious of what kind of legacy I wanted to leave with my own students. I started thinking seriously about what students would remember about my class 20 years from now, not just whether they'd learned to analyze literature or write coherent essays or identify literary devices. Those technical skills were important, but not sufficient. What I wanted was for them to remember my classroom as a place where they'd felt seen and valued and capable, a place where they could take intellectual risks without being humiliated, a place where mistakes were opportunities for learning rather than sources of shame, a place where someone believed in their potential even when they didn't believe in it themselves. I also became more open with my students about difficult topics, not sharing inappropriate details about my personal life or using them as my therapists, but being honest when life was hard, modeling resilience and healthy coping, showing them that adults struggle too and that struggling doesn't mean failing. When my father had his heart attack and I needed to take emergency leave, I told my junior English class that I'd be out for a week because my dad was sick and in the hospital and I needed to be with him. When I came back, several of them had made him cards without being asked, had drawn pictures and written little notes hoping he'd feel better soon, expressing sympathy in the particular way teenagers do when they're trying to be supportive but aren't quite sure how. One student, a quiet girl named Lily Chen, who rarely spoke up in class discussions despite clearly doing all the reading and thinking deeply about the texts, wrote in her card, "My grandfather had a heart attack 2 years ago. He's okay now, but it was really scary. Your dad will be okay too. And even if he's sad sometimes about what happened, that's normal. My mum says it's okay to be sad when bad things happen. She says being sad means you love people, and that's actually a good thing, even though it hurts." I kept that card in my desk drawer. I showed it to my father when he was well enough to appreciate it, when he could read it without his blood pressure spiking from the stress of remembering that period. The simple wisdom of a 16-year-old, being sad means you love people, and that's good, helped both of us give ourselves permission to feel what we were feeling without judgment, without rushing to get over it, without pretending we were fine when we clearly weren't, without performing recovery for other people's comfort. These small moments, these unexpected connections, these ways that pain and healing rippled out into the world and created new patterns and relationships. This was what Diane's burning couldn't touch. She'd destroyed objects, physical items that could be catalogued and photographed and reduced to ash. But she couldn't destroy relationships. She couldn't destroy the capacity for compassion that my mother had modelled throughout her life, and that now showed up in my teaching, in my father's increased community involvement, in the scholarship recipients who carried forward her commitment to educational equity. The second anniversary of my mother's death fell on a Saturday, about 8 months after Diane's burning and 4 months after the divorce was finalised. We'd established a tradition by then of gathering on that day, not for a sad memorial service where everyone wore black and spoke in hushed voices about loss, but for a celebration of her life where we'd cook her favourite meals, tell stories that made us laugh rather than cry, look through photos while sharing memories, watch videos we'd found of her directing school plays that someone had recorded on an old camcorder and had recently digitised. That year, my father's sister, my Aunt Caroline, who lived in Portland and whom I'd always been close to, suggested we expand the gathering to include anyone who'd known my mother and wanted to participate. Not just immediate family, but extended relatives, her teaching colleagues, former students we could track down, friends from her book club and community theatre work, neighbours from our old neighbourhood. We sent invitations through email and social media, not really knowing if anyone would come or whether this would end up being just the small family gathering we'd originally planned. More than 70 people showed up. 70 people on a Saturday afternoon who took time out of their weekends to gather in the community centre we'd rented, bringing food and photos and stories and their own grief and love and memories. Former students who were now in their 20s and 30s, some with children of their own. Teaching colleagues who'd retired or moved to other districts, but who still remembered my mother fondly. Friends who'd known her in different contexts, her book club where they'd met monthly for 15 years to discuss literary fiction, her community theatre group where she'd directed productions and occasionally acted in supporting roles, her church where she'd volunteered with the youth group. My father stood up to speak partway through the afternoon after people had eaten and mingled and shared some initial stories. He was nervous. I could see his hands shaking slightly as he held his note cards. But his voice was steady as he talked about my mother, about their 32-year marriage, about what she'd meant to him and what her loss had done to him, and how he was learning to carry that loss forward. Kate used to say that the measure of a life wasn't in accumulations or possessions or achievements, but in the ripples we create in other people's lives, he said. She said we're all stones dropped in water, creating ripples that spread out in ways we can't always see or predict or measure or control. Looking around this room, I see those ripples. I see the teachers she inspired who are now inspiring their own students. I see the students she believed in who are now believing in their own children. I see the friends she supported who are now supporting others going through similar struggles. I see proof that a person's impact doesn't end when they die. It continues, it grows, it spreads out into the future in ways they never could have anticipated. He paused, his voice getting thick with emotion. Someone tried to erase Kate from our lives by destroying her possessions. Someone tried to make it so we'd forget her, move on, stop talking about her, stop letting her be part of our family story. They failed. They failed so completely it's almost funny, because looking at all of you gathered here, all of you who loved her and were influenced by her and carry parts of her forward in your own lives and work, I realised that possessions aren't the person. Possessions are just objects. The person is the ripples. The person is the influence. The person is the love and lessons and impact that survive death and continue spreading. And those can't be burned. People were crying by the time he finished, including me, including my Aunt Caroline, including former students who'd brought tissues because they'd anticipated this would be emotional. But they weren't just sad tears. They were complicated tears, grief and love and gratitude and anger and hope all mixed together. In that way, human emotions actually exist, rather than the simplified single-note feelings we pretend to have, because complexity is harder to explain. After my father sat down, other people stood up to share their own memories and stories. Emily Tran, a former student who was now teaching English herself at a high school in Tacoma, talked about how my mother had helped her through her parents' divorce and failing grades and deep depression when she was 16, how my mother had stayed after school 3 times a week for an entire semester to tutor her and listen to her and believe in her when she'd stopped believing in herself. "I became a teacher because of Mrs. Harrison," Emily said. "She showed me what teaching could be when it's done with genuine care and high expectations. She saved my life, literally. And now I try to do the same thing for my students. Her impact ripples through every kid I teach." Marcus Rodriguez, who'd been one of my mother's students in her early teaching years and was now a principal at a middle school, talked about how my mother had been the first teacher who'd ever asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, who'd treated his answer, "I want to work with kids and help them," as legitimate and valuable rather than laughing or telling him to aim higher. "She told me that working with kids was the most important work anyone could do," Marcus said. "She told me that shaping young lives was more valuable than being a doctor or lawyer or CEO, that teachers are the foundation of everything else because we create all the other professionals. She made me proud to want to go into education instead of apologetic about it." That conversation changed my life trajectory. Story after story, impact after impact. Ripples spreading out from one person's life into dozens of others, then spreading from those dozens into hundreds more, then from hundreds into thousands. My mother had taught high school English for 23 years. Assuming an average of 120 students per year, 4 classes of 30 kids each, she'd directly taught approximately 2,760 students over her career. And those students had gone on to teach their own students, parent their own children, influence their own communities. Second-generation impact, third-generation impact. Exponential ripples spreading out from that initial stone dropped in water. I thought about Diane in that moment, standing in that community centre surrounded by 70 people who'd gathered to remember and celebrate someone Diane had tried to erase. Diane who'd thought destroying photo albums and wedding dresses and quilts would somehow eliminate my mother's presence from our lives. Diane who'd fundamentally misunderstood what makes someone matter, what makes someone memorable, what allows someone to continue influencing lives long after they're gone. It's not the stuff, I realized with absolute clarity. The stuff is nice to have, serves important psychological functions, provides tangible anchors to memory and continuity. But the stuff isn't the person. The person is the impact. The person is the relationships. The person is the values passed down and the lessons learned and the love that persists even after death. And those things, those intangible, immaterial, invisible things, those can't be destroyed by fire no matter how hot it burns, or how long it burns, or how thorough the destruction seems. The biggest surprise in all of this came about 18 months after the divorce was finalized, about 2 years after Diane's burning. My father, who'd sworn after Diane that he'd never date again, who'd told me repeatedly that he was done with romantic relationships and perfectly content to live alone with his books and his woodworking hobby and his volunteer work, met someone. Her name was Linda Morrison, no relation to my mother despite the shared last name, and she was a widow herself. Her husband had died 4 years earlier from complications of diabetes, and she understood grief and loss in a way someone who hasn't experienced it couldn't fully grasp. They met at a cardiac support group the hospital had recommended for heart attack survivors, a weekly meeting where people talked about their fears and struggles and recovery challenges, and gradually built community with others going through similar experiences. I was skeptical at first, protective of my father, terrified he'd make another mistake and bring someone into our lives who'd turn out to be destructive and cruel like Diane, who'd take advantage of his loneliness and vulnerability. I interviewed Linda like she was applying for a job, met her for coffee without my father present, asked direct questions about her intentions and expectations, tried to assess whether she was safe, whether she understood boundaries, whether she had the capacity to make room for my mother's memory instead of trying to compete with or erase it. But Linda was different from Diane in every way that mattered. When I cautiously mentioned my mother, watching carefully for signs of discomfort or jealousy, Linda leaned forward with genuine interest. "Tell me about her," she said. "I want to know about the woman who was such an important part of your dad's life. She shaped who he is. How can I know him without knowing something about her?" When my father showed Linda photos of my mother, not hiding them or apologizing for keeping them displayed in his condo, but sharing them openly, Linda studied them carefully and said, "She was beautiful. And from everything your dad has told me, she sounds like she was a remarkable person. I'm sorry you lost her so young. That must have been devastating for both of you." She asked to see the memory books my father and I had created, and she spent an entire evening going through them, reading stories, looking at photos, asking questions about my mother's teaching philosophy and her relationship with my father and what kind of person she'd been in everyday life beyond the curated highlights people usually share. "Thank you for sharing her with me," Linda said afterward. "I know this is a gift, letting me see these intimate parts of your history. I don't take that lightly. I understand that I'm not replacing anyone. I'm just hoping to add something new to a life that already had a lot of love and history." When Linda came to my father's condo and saw that he still had photos of my mother displayed throughout his living space, not shrine-like or obsessive, just present, part of his home and his life, she didn't ask him to remove them or make comments about living in the past or show any discomfort. She just accepted it as a normal part of who he was, someone who'd been married before and still loved the person he'd lost, someone whose past was part of his present and would always be part of his future. "My husband's photos are still all over my house too," she told me during one of our early conversations when I was still vetting her, still trying to determine if she was safe. Not because I'm stuck in the past or refusing to move forward, just because he was a huge part of my life for 26 years, and pretending he didn't exist would be ridiculous and disrespectful to our history. If I'm going to spend time with your father, I'm spending time with all of him, including his history and his first marriage and his grief. That's not threatening to me, that's just reality. That's how I knew Linda was genuinely different. That's how I knew she was fundamentally operating from a different place than Diane had been. She made room for my mother instead of trying to erase her. She understood that love doesn't erase previous love, that new relationships don't require destroying old relationships, that being someone's partner doesn't mean they have to forget everyone who came before. My father and Linda dated for about 2 years before deciding to move in together, taking it slow, making sure this was right, not rushing into legal entanglements or major commitments before they were both certain this relationship had long-term viability. They bought a small house together in a neighborhood halfway between both of their previous homes, combining their furniture and decorations and lives in a way that honored both of their histories. Linda's photos of her late husband hung alongside my father's photos of my mother. Her grown children from her first marriage visited for holidays alongside me. We celebrated occasions together, all of us, people who'd loved people who'd died, people who were building new family configurations, people who understood that loss and love can coexist. On what would have been my mother's 60th birthday, about 5 years after Diane's burning, we held another celebration similar to the one we'd done on the 2nd anniversary. This time we invited everyone who'd contributed to the memory books, all my mother's former colleagues and students we could track down, extended family, friends, community members who'd known her in various contexts. About 90 people showed up to a community centre we'd rented for the afternoon, bringing food and photos and more stories we'd never heard before. Linda was there, not trying to be the centre of attention or make the event about her, just present as support for my father, helping organise food and clean up afterward, and take photos so the rest of us could be fully present in the moment. At one point during the afternoon, she stood up and said something that made everyone pause, that shifted something in the room. "I never met Catherine," Linda said, her voice steady and clear. I came into Roger's life years after she died, but I feel like I know her through all of you, through your stories and memories, through the memory books and the scholarship fund, through the way she shaped Roger and Jessica into the people they are. And I want to say thank you to her, even though she can't hear me. Thank you for raising Jessica to be strong and kind and resilient. Thank you for teaching students who went on to teach others, creating ripples that continue spreading. Thank you for loving Roger in a way that made him capable of loving again after loss. Your impact is still here, still growing, still mattering. And I'm grateful and honored to be part of a family that honors you so beautifully. It was a generous thing to say, a gracious acknowledgement from the woman who'd come into my father's life after both my mother and Diane, who could have felt threatened by my mother's continued presence in our family story, but chose instead to add her voice to the chorus of people keeping that story alive, making it public, ensuring it continued. After Linda sat down, Emily Tran approached me, the former student who'd first told me about my mother helping her through her parents' divorce and depression years ago. She was 38 now, established in her teaching career, married with 2 young children who'd come to the celebration with her. She was carrying that same worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that my mother had given her almost 2 decades ago, the spine creased and pages dog-eared from repeated readings. I brought this to show my kids, Emily said, opening the book to the inside cover where my mother's handwriting was still visible despite years of handling. For Emily, you have more strength than you know. Keep going, keep believing in yourself. I'm proud of you. Mrs. H. I want them to know about the teacher who changed their mum's life, Emily continued. I want them to understand that teachers matter, that one person believing in you can make all the difference between giving up and pushing forward. And I want them to know your mum's name, Catherine Harrison. I want them to remember her even though they never met her. Thank you, I said, genuinely moved by her intentionality about passing down memory and gratitude to the next generation. That means more than you probably realize. Your dad was amazing too with the scholarship fund, Emily added. Did you know I've been on the selection committee for the last 6 years? I get to read applications from students who want to be teachers, students who write about wanting to be the kind of teacher Mrs. Harrison was, based on stories they've heard from older siblings or parents who were her students. Second-generation impact, third-generation impact. That's how far her ripples have spread. Second-generation impact, third-generation impact. Students my mother never met, being inspired by stories about her teaching, choosing education careers because of her example filtered through former students who became teachers themselves. That was legacy. That was what survived not just Diane's burning, but death itself, time itself, the inevitable erosion of all things physical and material. My mother had been dead for 10 years at that point. Diane had burned her belongings 5 years earlier. And yet my mother's impact was still growing, still spreading, still touching lives she'd never met and never could have anticipated, influencing decisions and careers and life trajectories in ways that would continue long after everyone in that room was dead themselves. Esi, Koyi. I'm 38 now as I write this, sitting in my home office on a Saturday morning while my daughter, yes, I eventually got married and had a child of my own, practices piano in the living room, and my husband makes breakfast in the kitchen. It's an ordinary morning in an ordinary life, which feels like its own kind of miracle after everything we've been through, after all the trauma and loss and rebuilding. I married a man named David Chen when I was 33, about 4 years after Diane's burning. He's a school counselor, someone who understands education and adolescence, and the importance of relationships in learning. He never met my mother, but he loves hearing stories about her, understands that she's part of my family history and identity, has never once made me feel like I need to minimize or hide or apologize for continuing to talk about her and honor her memory. We have a daughter named Catherine, Kate for short, who's 7 years old now and full of questions about everything, including the grandmother she never got to meet. I tell her stories about my mother regularly, show her pictures from the memory books, teach her some of the same lessons my mother taught me about kindness and perseverance, and the importance of standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. "Grandma Kate was a teacher like you, Mummy," my daughter announced one day when she was 5, working through family relationships and similarities. "She helped kids learn to read and think and be smart. That's important work." "Very important work," I agreed. "Some of the most important work anyone can do." "Did someone try to make her disappear?" Kate asked, and I realized she must have overheard more of my conversations with David than I'd thought. Must have been piecing together the story from fragments and half-heard explanations. "Someone tried," I said carefully, not wanting to lie, but also not wanting to traumatize my 7-year-old with the full horror of what Diane had done. "They destroyed some things that belonged to her, things that were special to us. But they couldn't destroy what really mattered. They couldn't destroy the memories or the love or the ways she changed people's lives." "Good," Kate said with 7-year-old certainty and moral clarity, "because love is stronger than mean people. That's what you always say. Out of the mouths of children, as the saying goes." She was right. Love is stronger than mean people, not because it defeats them in some dramatic confrontation or makes them suffer appropriate consequences, but because it outlasts them, persists after their hatred has burned itself out, continues building and growing and spreading while their destruction remains finite and limited. My father lived to be 79 years old. He had 13 years after the heart attack, 13 bonus years that Diane's cruelty nearly stole from him, but didn't. 13 years he used well. He retired from engineering at 62 and became a volunteer tutor at the Adult Literacy Centre, helping people learn to read, finding new purpose in education work that honoured my mother's legacy in concrete, practical ways. He travelled with Linda, Ireland and Scotland and New Zealand and Italy, taking trips they'd both always wanted to take but had never managed with their first spouses. He was present for Kate's childhood, teaching her to fish and helping with science fair projects and attending every single school concert and play and award ceremony, being the grandfather I'd always hoped he'd get to be. When he died, peacefully, in his sleep, from congestive heart failure that was a delayed consequence of that original heart attack damage, I grieved deeply, but without the complicated trauma that had accompanied my mother's death. He'd lived a full life after surviving Diane. He'd recovered from her betrayal and rebuilt his world. He'd found love again with Linda. He'd been a present, engaged grandfather. He'd died knowing he was loved and that his life had mattered and that he'd created ripples of his own that would continue spreading. At his funeral, I told the story of Diane's burning. Not in detail. It was a funeral, not a therapy session, but the essential narrative. How she'd destroyed my mother's belongings out of jealousy. How it had put my father in the hospital with a heart attack. How we'd survived and rebuilt, and found ways to honour my mother's memory despite, and perhaps even because of the destruction. "Someone tried to erase our family history," I said to the mourners gathered at the service. "They tried to eliminate evidence that my mother had existed and mattered. They tried to make us forget her, move on, stop letting her be part of our story. And they failed so completely it's almost comical. Because look around this room. Look at all of you who are here. Former students of my mother's who became teachers themselves. Colleagues who learned from her. Scholarship recipients who carry her name forward. Friends she supported. Family who loved her. All of you are evidence that she existed and mattered. All of you are living proof that love and impact survive even the most determined attempts at erasure." I talked about how my father had responded to that cruelty not with bitterness or revenge fantasies or ongoing hatred that would have poisoned his remaining years, but with creation and building and moving forward. The memory books, the scholarship fund, the choice to keep living and loving and contributing despite the loss. That was who he was, someone who chose creation over destruction, building over burning, love over hate, hope over despair. even when he had every reason to become bitter and angry and closed off to new relationships, he chose to stay open, to find love again with Linda, to be present for his granddaughter, to keep honoring my mother while also moving forward with his own life and building new memories and relationships. After the funeral, Emily Tran, the former student who'd become a recurring presence in these milestone moments, approached me with her 2 teenage children in tow. She was 50 now, silver starting to show in her hair, wearing reading glasses on a chain around her neck the way my mother used to, carrying that same worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that my mother had given her 32 years earlier. "I brought this to show my kids again," she said, opening the book to my mother's inscription, now faded but still legible. "I want them to know that your mum and your dad both mattered, that their influence continues, that the scholarship fund they created has now awarded 43 scholarships over 20 years to aspiring teachers. 43 people who are teaching because your family believed in them and supported them financially and connected them to this legacy of educational commitment. That's second-generation impact, third-generation impact, impact that spreads exponentially. 43 scholarship recipients. I hadn't realised the number had gotten that high, hadn't been tracking it that closely, because the fund now ran itself with a selection committee and established criteria and an endowment that would continue funding scholarships long after everyone currently involved was dead. 43 teachers whose careers had been supported by money given in my mother's name, who'd gone into classrooms across Washington state and beyond, who were teaching thousands of students using methods and approaches influenced by stories about my mother's teaching that they'd read in the scholarship materials. "Your mum has been dead for 20 years, Emily said, doing the math in her head. "Diane burned her belongings 15 years ago, and yet here we are, still talking about her, still honouring her, still spreading her influence to people and places she never could have reached when she was alive. That woman tried to erase your mother and ended up making her more present, more influential, more deliberately remembered than she would have been otherwise. That's the ultimate failure." Emily was right. Diane's attempt at erasure had backfired completely, had become the catalyst for us to be more intentional about preserving and sharing and spreading my mother's legacy. The burning had hurt. It still hurts. There's still grief when I think about the specific objects that were destroyed and can never be recovered. But it had also motivated us to create something more lasting than photo albums in boxes in a garage. It had pushed us to build the memory books, start the scholarship fund, organise celebrations where dozens of people gathered to share stories, create a living, growing legacy rather than just a static collection of artefacts. I still think about Diane sometimes, though less frequently and with less emotional intensity as the years pass and healing progresses. I don't know where she is or what she's doing. I've heard through very distant connections, acquaintances of acquaintances, people who barely knew her, that she's been married and divorced at least twice more since my father, that she has a pattern of finding widowers and then becoming jealous of their late wives, that she apparently never learned that you can't control people by trying to destroy their pasts. But those are just rumours, unverified gossip that might not even be accurate. And more importantly, it doesn't matter. Her patterns, her problems, her inability to change or grow or develop healthier ways of relating, none of that is my concern anymore. She's irrelevant to my life now, a person who caused significant harm once and then was removed from our lives like a tumour that was excised and treated and monitored to make sure it didn't return. What matters is what we built from the wreckage she created. The memory books that my daughter Kate pages through, asking questions about the grandmother she never met. The scholarship fund that just awarded its 43rd and 44th scholarships to aspiring teachers. The photo of my parents on their wedding day that hangs in my hallway, rescued from digital backups, because Diane didn't know those existed when she burned the physical albums. The stories I tell Kate about her grandmother, keeping memory alive through narrative and intention. What matters is that my father had 13 good years after that heart attack, years filled with love and purpose and contribution and meaning. That he died knowing he'd survived someone's attempt to destroy him, that he'd built a good life despite that cruelty, that his legacy would continue through me and through Kate, and through the students my mother taught, who became teachers themselves, who are teaching their own students. What matters is that I learned it's possible to survive devastating betrayal and loss, that you can lose irreplaceable things and still build a meaningful life, that some people are cruel and destructive, but they don't have to define your story or determine your future or destroy your capacity for love and trust and building. That love really is stronger than hate, not because it defeats hate in some dramatic confrontation, but because it outlasts hate, persists after hate has burned itself out, continues building while hate destroys, creates ripples that spread far beyond what hate can damage. I teach my high school English students about resilience now, not explicitly discussing my own story, but drawing on what I learned from surviving it. I teach them that characters in literature who survive terrible things and keep going aren't weak or passive. They're demonstrating a different kind of strength than the dramatic hero who fights and conquers. I teach them that rebuilding after loss is harder than never losing anything in the first place. That continuing to love and trust and build after betrayal takes more courage than never being betrayed. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep going, keep showing up, keep building, keep choosing love over bitterness and creation over destruction. Some of my students get it immediately because they're living it, dealing with difficult family situations, navigating loss and grief and trauma, learning to survive in systems that weren't built for their well-being or success. Others won't understand until later, until life hands them challenges they didn't see coming and didn't prepare for. But I plant the seeds anyway, tell the stories without making them about me, model the resilience I want them to develop. Hope they'll remember these lessons when they need them most. My mother did the same thing, I realize now, with the clarity that comes from doing the same work she did. She taught literature not just as analysis of texts, but as preparation for life. She taught her students how to think critically, how to empathize with different perspectives, how to find meaning in difficult narratives, how to recognize manipulation and propaganda, and emotional abuse disguised as concern or love or care. She equipped them with tools they'd need long after they'd forgotten the specifics of The Great Gatsby or Macbeth, or their eyes were watching God. And those tools worked, are still working. Emily Tran survived her parents' bitter divorce and her teenage depression, and went on to help other kids survive theirs as a teacher and mentor. The student who sent me that letter about becoming a teacher because of my mother is now a principal helping hundreds of kids. The 43 scholarship recipients are teaching thousands of students. The ripples continue spreading, generation after generation, impact compounding over time like interest on an investment that grows exponentially. Diane tried to stop those ripples by burning my mother's physical possessions. But she fundamentally misunderstood what creates ripples. It's not things. It's not objects that can be contained in boxes or photographed or destroyed by fire. It's actions, words, relationships, beliefs, values, the ways we touch other people's lives for better or worse. Those can't be burned. Those can't be destroyed by someone else's jealousy or cruelty or hate. Those persist and grow and spread regardless of what anyone does to try to stop them. Last year, on what would have been my mother's 65th birthday, we held another celebration. Smaller this time, just family and close friends, about 30 people total, a more intimate gathering than the large public events we'd held in previous years. We gathered in my backyard on a warm September afternoon, ate food my mother would have loved, told stories both old and new, shared memories that had aged like wine and gotten richer over time. Linda stood up at one point, glass of wine in hand, and said something that made everyone pause and really listen. "I never met Catherine," she began, her voice carrying across the quiet yard where people were finishing dessert and coffee. I came into this family's life years after she died, after Diane's destruction, after the worst of the crisis had passed. But I feel like I know Catherine intimately through all of you, through Roger's stories before he died, through Jessica's memories, through the scholarship materials and the memory books, and these annual gatherings where her name is spoken with such love and respect. She paused, gathering her thoughts. And I want to say something that might sound strange, but I think it's important. What Diane did, the burning, the cruelty, the attempt at erasure, in some terrible way, it made Catherine more present in this family than she might have been otherwise. Not that I'm grateful for what Diane did, not at all, but I've watched how this family responded to that cruelty. Instead of letting it destroy you, instead of letting Diane's hatred win, you chose to be more intentional about remembering. You created systems and structures and rituals that ensure Catherine's memory doesn't just fade passively over time, but gets actively preserved and shared and passed down. She looked at me, then at Kate, who was sitting at my feet playing with a toy. Kate will know her grandmother not just through vague childhood memories that fade and distort, but through detailed stories and written records and photographs and the testimony of dozens of people whose lives Catherine touched. She'll know her grandmother's values through the scholarship fund that bears her name. She'll understand her grandmother's impact through meeting people like Emily, who became teachers because of Catherine's influence. That's remarkable. That's a gift that came from choosing to respond to destruction with creation, to hatred with love, to erasure with intentional remembering. Linda was right, and hearing her articulate it made me see the past 15 years in a new light. We could have let Diane's burning destroy us. We could have let the loss of those physical objects, the wedding dress, the quilts, the photo albums, all of it, become the defining tragedy of our family story. We could have spent years pursuing revenge or justice or trying to make Diane pay for what she'd done. We could have let bitterness and anger consume us, poison our relationships, prevent us from building new connections or finding new joy. But we didn't. We chose differently. We chose to honor my mother by living the values she'd taught us: resilience, compassion, determination, the refusal to let difficult people make us less than who we wanted to be. We chose to build rather than destroy, to create rather than tear down, to preserve rather than eliminate. We chose to turn our pain into something productive, our grief into something generative, our loss into something that could benefit others. And in doing so, we proved Diane wrong about everything. She thought she could erase my mother by burning her belongings. She thought physical objects were what kept my mother present in our lives, what made her relevant, what gave her continued power over our family. She thought by destroying those things, she could destroy my mother's influence and finally get the undivided attention and validation she craved from my father. But she was wrong about all of it. She misunderstood what makes someone matter, what makes someone memorable, what allows someone to continue influencing lives long after they're gone. It's not the stuff we keep in boxes. It's the impact we have on people. It's the relationships we build. It's the values we pass down. It's the ways we change lives, big and small, through our words and actions and presence. My mother matters more now, is more consciously present in our daily lives, is more deliberately honored and remembered than she was before Diane's burning. Not because of the burning itself, but because of how we responded to it. We could have let it destroy us. Instead, we let it motivate us to be more intentional, more creative, more committed to making sure my mother's legacy lived on in meaningful ways. That's what I want people to take from this story. Not that Diane was terrible, which is obvious and not particularly useful information, but that it's possible to survive terrible things done by terrible people. It's possible to heal from devastating losses and betrayals. It's possible to build something good and meaningful and lasting even after someone has tried their hardest to destroy what you love most. You don't have to let the cruel people win. You don't have to let their actions define your story or determine your future or destroy what matters most to you. You can survive, you can heal, you can rebuild. You can find new ways to honor what was lost while also creating what comes next. You can turn destruction into motivation for preservation. You can transform hatred into commitment to love. You can convert erasure into intentional remembering. It won't be easy. It will take time, years, not months, maybe decades. It will take help, therapy, supportive friends and family, people who understand what you're going through and validate your experience. It will take intentionality, making conscious choices about how you remember, how you heal, how you move forward. It will take courage to keep going when everything in you wants to give up, when the grief feels too heavy to carry, when you can't see how you'll ever feel normal again. But it's possible. I know because we did it. My father did it. I did it. Our family did it together, supporting each other through the worst of it and celebrating together as we rebuilt. We survived Diane's attempt to destroy us. We healed from the trauma she caused. We built new traditions, new ways of remembering, new connections that honor the past while creating the future. My mother's physical belongings are gone, burned to ash 15 years ago in a backyard fire barrel by a jealous, insecure woman who thought she could erase my mother from our lives by eliminating her possessions. But my mother herself, the person she was, the teacher she was, the mother and wife she was, the friend she was, the impact she had on hundreds of lives over 54 years of living, that survives. That persists. That lives on in me, in Kate, in Linda, who never met her but honors her memory, in the 43 scholarship recipients who carry her name into their own teaching careers, in the thousands of former students who still remember her classes decades later and credit her with changing their trajectories, in the teachers who learned their craft by watching her teach and are now passing those methods on to their own mentees, in the stories we tell and the values we uphold and the way we choose to live our lives. And no fire, no matter how hot it burns or how complete the destruction seems, can ever change that fundamental truth. What truly matters cannot be burned. What love creates cannot be destroyed by hate. What impact generates continues spreading long after the person who created it is gone. Diane tried to prove otherwise. She spent years being jealous of a dead woman, years resenting my mother's continued presence in our family story, years planning how to eliminate every physical reminder of her existence. And then she acted on that jealousy, burned everything she could find, bragged about it, showed no remorse. And she failed. Failed so completely, so utterly, so absolutely, that her failure became its own kind of evidence. Evidence that you cannot erase people by destroying their possessions, that legacy lives in impact rather than artifacts, that love survives attempts at erasure if people make the conscious choice to preserve and honor and remember. My name is Jessica Marie Beck. I'm 38 years old. I teach high school English in Seattle, Washington, following in my mother's footsteps, though I never consciously decided to do that. I'm married to David Chen, who never met my mother but loves her through loving me and understanding that she's part of my foundation, part of who I am. We have a daughter named Catherine, Kate, who's 7 years old and full of questions about the grandmother she'll never meet in person but knows intimately through stories and photos, and the living legacy we've worked so hard to preserve. My mother's name was Catherine Marie Harrison Beck. She taught high school English for 23 years. She loved literature and theatre and thunderstorms and her family and her students. She died of breast cancer at 54 years old, far too young, before she got to meet her granddaughter or retire or travel or do any of the things she'd planned for her later years. Someone tried to erase her. Someone destroyed every physical reminder we had of her life, her clothes, her jewelry, her photos, her letters, her quilts, her teaching materials, everything. Someone bragged about this destruction and showed no remorse. Someone put my father in the hospital and nearly killed him with the stress and cruelty of this act. That someone failed. My mother is still here, still remembered, still honored, still influencing lives through the ripples she created that continue spreading outward. still present in the scholarship fund that bears her name, in the memory books we created, in the stories we tell, in the values we live, in the teachers she inspired who inspire their own students, in the exponential impact that compounds over decades and generations. Still here, still mattering, still loved beyond what words can express or fires can destroy or jealousy can diminish. And nothing, no cruelty, no betrayal, no burning, no attempt at erasure, can ever change that truth or take that away from us, or stop those ripples from spreading into the future as far as love can reach. That's the story, that's the survival, that's the victory that looks nothing like revenge, but everything like resilience, nothing like justice, but everything like healing, nothing like defeating an enemy, but everything like refusing to let an enemy defeat you. We won not by making Diane suffer, but by refusing to let her make us suffer permanently. We won by surviving, by rebuilding, by creating something meaningful from something terrible. We won by choosing love over hate, building over destroying, remembering over forgetting. And we'll keep winning every day, every year, as long as we keep telling these stories, keep funding these scholarships, keep teaching these students, keep living these values, keep spreading these ripples that originated with my mother's life, and continue flowing outward into a future she never got to see but helped create through how she lived and loved and taught. That's enough. That has to be enough. That is enough. The ashes are gone, scattered by wind and rain, absorbed into earth, returned to the cycle of nature. The objects Diane burned have been gone for 15 years and will never be recovered. But the love remains, the impact endures, the ripples continue, the memory persists, the legacy grows. And that surviving, that persisting, that continuing, that growing, that's what it means to win against someone who tried to destroy you with fire and hatred and cruelty. Not by burning back, but by refusing to be consumed. By choosing again and again, day after day, year after year, to build instead of burn, to remember instead of forget, to love instead of hate, to create instead of destroy. That's the whole story. That's the whole truth. That's the whole victory. And it's enough.